Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining for our webinar today. This is the Foundations, Managed Care Transitions, and Adult Behavioral Health Home and Community-Based Services Implementation webinar. Today's webinar is part of a 4-part webinar series, and today's portion of the webinar series will be presented by Mick Silver, MCTAC, the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, part of our Training Assistance Training Partners group. So with that, my name is Meg Beyer, and I will be joined by my colleague Boris Vilgorin shortly, and we're going to get started today. So thank you. So as we mentioned, just when getting started, this training and webinar series was developed by a robust group of technical assistants and New York State partners. As you can see on the slide, these are the various partners who contributed to this collaborative development process. They can include CPI, the Center for Practice Innovations, NYS, the Mick Silver Institute at NYU, CASA, the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, OASIS, and OMH. And again, all of these partners really help to develop the content and material for this training. You will be hearing from various partners as our webinar series develops, as there are 3 additional webinars that will follow this one. So thank you to our partners for helping to develop this. All right, so I'm going to start off in terms of setting the stage today. Really, this webinar is to set the foundation and give everyone a general sense of understanding around the large changes going on within New York State's behavioral health system, as well as the implementation of the new home and community-based services for adults in New York State. So with that, I'm going to get started. So this slide really looks at Medicaid expenditures for the year 2013, which is a couple years past, but still the number on the screen, as you can see, is quite significant. $49 billion was spent approximately on Medicaid in New York State for the year 2013. And as a result of this, since this was a significant portion of New York State's budget, the Medicaid redesign team has worked to transform the system in a way that not only delivers better care, but it is more efficient in cost. We're going to talk through what that actually means as we go through the webinar, but I just kind of wanted to start out with that number on the screen as a figure, as a jumping off point. So really the Medicaid redesign team was put together to address the underlying healthcare costs and quality issues in New York State's Medicaid behavioral health and, larger Medicaid system in New York State. Governor Cuomo created the Medicaid redesign team to develop a multi-year reform plan. Multiple key stakeholders were invited to the table in the spirit of collaboration. And the redesign team is really premised on the idea that the only way to control cost is to improve the health of program participants. We'll talk a little bit about the triple aim shortly, but as you can see, that's really embedded in the Medicaid redesign team's vision. The action plan launched a series of innovative solutions designed to better manage care and also reward providers to help people be healthy. And more than 200 initiatives were created out of this Medicaid redesign team. These initiatives implemented programmatic changes to the way that healthcare is delivered, reimbursed, and managed to ensure that individuals are receiving quality care in the foremost efficient manner. So I'm going to pass along to my colleague Boris Vilgorin for a little bit to speak about some of the initiatives and maybe the goals.
Sure. Thank you, Meg. So before I actually get into the initiatives, excuse me, I want to just talk about the goal of this 4-part series, which also will at the end have office hours available for folks to call in and ask any questions that we might have not addressed or clarify some topics that needs clarification. So the goal really here is to, as Meg said with this particular first webinar, is to really lay the foundations of all the changes that been happening in New York State for behavioral health and continuing to happen. The other big part of this presentation, which we'll cover in the other 3 webinars that are going to be pre-recorded as well, is to really give health home care managers, the health home leads, the behavioral health providers, and the health plans, and really everybody who touches the behavioral health system, a sense of what we're referring to as the behavioral health landscape. And what that really refers to is really to give people an understanding of all the services that behavioral health offers. Not just HCBS, we'll definitely have a whole webinar devoted to HCBS, but also all services that sometimes are referred to as the state plan services or programs, and some folks refer to them in different ways, but we want to cover it all. And then with the 4th webinar to really tie it all together and talk about how individuals could be working with, especially the health home care managers, but others, in making choices that fit their needs at that particular time, which services or programs are more appropriate for them, and what could better move them towards recovery, with their particular behavioral health diagnosis. So really, again, the goal here is to really set the foundation, provide the landscape, and at the end kind of tie it all together with, maybe some examples and some thoughts on how individuals might navigate, and hopefully for all of you who are listening, would be helpful in also as you work with clients and members, to kind of guide them through their recovery process as well. So with that, let's jump back to some of the MRT initiatives, because one of the biggest initiative is the managed care one, but all of them are built on a triple aim. As you saw in the MRT, one of the biggest emphasis was improve quality and outcomes, which was exciting to see that it's part of the MRT initiative. Of course, decreased cost is important as well, but also not to forget as the 3rd part of the triple aim is also to improve member experience, which is very important in achieving all of the triple aim. So all the initiatives, not only what the MRT refers to, but on a national level and within managed care and so forth, always looks at all of the initiatives through the lens of triple aim and how the initiatives address either all of these 3 elements of triple aim or at least part of them. So again, the initiative, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest one was transitioning behavioral health services into managed care for many years. A lot of behavioral health services, not all, but a good portion of them have been what's called carved out, meaning though individuals that were, even though individuals were enrolled in mainstream Medicaid managed care, their behavioral health services or some of the behavioral health services were not included and still billed directly to Medicaid. So one of the biggest initiatives on behavioral health side was transitioning and moving those services under the umbrella of Medicaid managed care. That transition occurred on October 1st for New York City and of 2015, and July 1st of this year, 2016, for the rest of the state. And again, consumers enrolled in a Medicaid managed care was covered under fee-for-service through SSI, also began to be covered by Medicaid managed care. So again, the SSI individuals who for, again, many years were carved out in addition to all the services are now carved in as well. Again, it means that the managed Medicaid company is it's under their benefit package at this time.
Great. And just to remind everyone, this is a foundations webinar, so we might be repetitive in some of the material we're presenting, but we really feel that these are the critical components for everyone to truly understand to make the system work the best way possible. And also just a gentle reminder that what we're talking about today really only applies to adult providers. I know that we've provided technical assistance for all providers across New York State, but today's webinar really does focus on those who are providers for adult behavioral health services. So just to emphasize that before we move forward. Yeah, thank you, Boris.
All right, next slide. Okay. So another big initiative through the MRT has been the HARP initiative, and that's the Health and Recovery Plan initiative that's applicable to the adults 21 years and older who have either a serious mental illness and substance abuse disorder, diagnosis, of course. And these are specialty lines of business under Medicaid managed care. HARP, individuals who are eligible, and we'll talk more about HCBS and HARP later in this presentation, but HARP, just to be very clear here, again, is a specialty line of business within the mainstream Medicaid managed care plans who chose to participate in the HARP initiative. And of course, the HIV special needs plans could partake in that as well. And those initiatives started, the HARP initiative started on January 1st, 2016 in New York City, and October 1st, 2016 in the rest of state. So programs, I referred to earlier to programs were carved out or not included in managed care that have transitioned, and some programs that were included but now also are included with the SSI individuals. So the ones to really focus on that have probably the bulk of the transition, we'll just highlight some of them here, are the Personalized Recovery Oriented Services Program, which is known as PROS, Continuing Day Treatment Program, CDT, IPRT, ACT services transition to PROS as well. We also have the transition of the OASIS programs like the OASIS Clinic, the opiate treatment program, the outpatient rehab, and the new OASIS Residential Redesign Program. These are the programs that recently transitioned with the timelines that were indicated, as well as the mental health programs that I outlined above.
And if you're listening to this webinar and are interested in more information on all of these programs, the details of how someone who might be eligible for the programs, we are actually going to be having a follow-up webinar in this series that goes through these programs here. So stay tuned. We'll have an additional component of this webinar series is actually walking through what all of these programs and services are. Today we're just kind of doing, again, an overview, but there will be a future webinar that goes into more detail around these programs on this slide here. Okay.
All right. So just to give folks a little understanding on the workflow or flow of this, so there's Medicaid managed care, and then there's the behavioral component of the Medicaid managed care. The individuals could either be in the mainstream or in the HARP, and again, the individuals need to be eligible in HARP. And as of today, the only way somebody becomes eligible, the state, meaning OMH and OASIS, identifies eligible individuals today. That's how somebody becomes HARP eligible. And again, later we'll talk about HCBS eligibility. And I think it's important to underscore that HARP and the HCBS is very much related. And I know some folks sometimes use them interchangeably, but they are not to be used interchangeably. HARP is a line of business and HCBS is a line of services. And so we want to just emphasize that. So again, just coming back to the flow here, so an individual who is enrolled in Medicaid managed care, either in mainstream or HARP. If they're in HARP, they would have to be 21 years of age and older. They could also be part of the HIV SNP program. Then they would go through a process, which we'll go through later in this presentation, of becoming HCBS eligible, or going through the process to see if they're HCBS eligible, which you can see if you continue going through this workflow. They're either not eligible or deemed to be eligible. And again, we'll we'll cover more of that later on in the presentation, where we focus more on HCBS at that time. Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about HCBS, Adult Behavioral Health Home and Community-Based Services. Before I do that, I just want to point out that Boris and I probably will mention a couple acronyms on this webinar today. There are, by nature of the work, just a lot of terms and acronyms out there. And I think part of really delivering great service is understanding what all of these different terms and acronyms mean. So we actually have developed a glossary and an acronym worksheet, and that can be found at MCTAC's website under some of our resources and tools. Just noticing that we have an acronym right there, Home and Community-Based Services. So with that, I'm going to get started and talk through a little bit more about them. So here right now we have the menu of services that are offered for Adult Behavioral Health HCBS. As you can see, we've clustered them into different portions. We have the rehabilitation services, which are comprised of psychosocial rehab, as well as community psychiatric support and treatment, along with their accompanying acronyms that follow. There's also habilitation, crisis respite, which is divided between short-term crisis respite and intensive crisis respite. There are educational support services, individual employment support services, which is divided between pre-vocational, transitional, intensive supported, and ongoing supported employment. There are empowerment services, which are really built around peer support. There are family support and training services, and there's also non-medical transport, which can only be provided by Medicaid transportation vendors. And there will be a webinar forthcoming later this fall or winter with more information about this for rest of state providers. For New York City providers, we hosted a webinar earlier this year, and it can actually be found on MCTAC's website. That's mctac.org. But again, this is the constellation of the different menu of services for Adult Behavioral Health HCBS. And again, today we are just kind of reviewing the overarching components. There will be an additional webinar in this different webinar series that goes through specifically the different components of each HCBS service, as well as settings, billing, details as well. So that will be forthcoming in this 4-part webinar series. Okay, so I'm going to review a little bit about what the HCBS value and core principles are. So as you can see here, the development of HARPS was really built around promoting improvement in the behavioral health system as we move closer into a recovery-based managed care delivery model. And some of the main components and principles and values that really are embodied in home and community-based services are in these different colored boxes on the screen right now. We'll talk a little bit more about person-centered care, which is really at the core of these services, recovery-oriented services. As you'll see in more detail as we go through the different HCBS services, recovery-oriented is a major value. There's also the importance of integrated services, integrating both physical and behavioral health, connecting both to make sure that an individual's pathway to service is integrated, and really working with them on the pathway to wellness and recovery. Data-driven is critically important in this service, as is evidence-based practice. Trauma-informed is a large component and value in these different services that are offered. Peer-supported is critically important. As you saw, there's an empowerment service in the HCBS menu, and that's based around peer support. Also critically important is that these services are culturally competent and really based around person-centered, again. Additionally, these services are flexible and mobile. They're inclusive of an individual's social network, as well as this last one, which I think is very important, especially for those of you who are tuning in. I'm sure you would agree, coordination and collaboration is key. And you'll see as we walk through the workflow, the different parties that really need to work together and collaborate, whether that be a home and community-based service provider themselves, a health home care manager, or a representative from the MCO working on authorization for these services. So again, these just are the core values and principles for HCBS services. So in general, these are just some of the modalities and settings in which these services can be offered. Other than psychosocial rehab and family support and training, which can be offered in a group format, all of the other HCBS services for adults in behavioral health must be provided on a one-to-one basis. So besides psychosocial rehab and family support and training, which are provided in a group, can be provided in a group setting, all other HCBS services are provided one-on-one. And then in keeping with those values and core principles that we reviewed on the previous slide, all of these services should be provided in a home and community-based setting whenever possible, which really makes sense given the name of these services. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about behavioral health, adult behavioral health HCBS eligibility and how one might find themselves eligible for these services. Okay, so we kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier when Boris walked us through the basic workflow. We're going to go through a much more detailed workflow, but the state has identified HARP enrolled, Health and Recovery Plan enrolled Medicaid beneficiaries that are aged 21 and older. So these, again, on this slide, we're walking through what would make an individual eligible for HCBS services. So they would be identified by the state as HARP enrolled and Medicaid beneficiaries aged 21 and older, or they could be enrolled in an HIV SNP and determined by the state to be HARP eligible. The individual, in order to receive HCBS services, would meet the eligibility criteria on the HCBS eligibility assessment. Again, we'll talk about that in a few slides. Tier 1, so they would be determined eligible for either Tier 1, which is services that include employment, education, and peer support services, those empowerment services, or they would be deemed eligible for Tier 1 and Tier 2, which essentially Tier 2 is all of the HCBS services.
Right. So, and just to underscore here, just because somebody is eligible for these services doesn't mean that they need them, want them, at any particular time. All this assessment does is identify, one, if the individual is eligible based on the assessment, two, what services they're really eligible for. And again, to underscore, because we know there's some confusion out there, when Tier 2 is determined, again, as Meg just said, the individual is eligible for all services, inclusive of all the Tier 1 services.
That's right. And as Boris just noted, again, getting back to, the values and core principles, as you can tell, even if someone is eligible for all of the services, in working in a person-centered manner, you would work with the individual to determine if they want to receive all the services. Just because they're eligible does not automatically mean that they would receive the services, which we will get to further in the presentation. And the last piece on this slide is in regards to H codes, which are available on e-PACES. And there are different H codes which would indicate HCBS eligibility. And these are some of the specific codes that are related to HARP and HCBS within e-PACES. I'll go through this quickly, but in general, so we have our H codes here on this slide. H9, if you were to look up an individual, and H9 was listed next to them, H9 indicates HARP eligible, but pending enrollment. So this person has been determined to be eligible for HARP according to New York State, but they have yet to be enrolled. H1 means that the individual is actually HARP enrolled. So this is the point that if you are a health home care manager, you could begin the New York State Community Mental Health Assessment Process. That is a long acronym. That stands for the eligibility assessment, the full assessment that is done to determine an individual's eligibility for certain HCBS services. Okay. Then we get to H2 and H3. These are specific H codes within EPACES for adult behavioral health HCBS eligibility, only for those individuals who have already been deemed HARP enrolled. So H2 would identify a person that has enrolled in a HARP, and it also indicates that that person has been assessed and determined to be eligible for Tier 1 of HCBS. So that means peer supports, employment supports, and education supports. So again, H2 identifies that the person has been enrolled in a HARP plan and that they have been assessed, they've done the eligibility assessment, and were determined to be eligible for Tier 1. H3 identifies a person that has been enrolled in a HARP and that has been deemed eligible, they've been assessed and deemed eligible for Tier 2 of HCBS, which is all of the HCBS services. And just to point out, there's additional information, additional EPACES and HARP HCBS codes that can be found in the eMedNE website. And if you have more questions, we would just direct you there. Okay. Next, we have this workflow again, which Boris walked us through. It kind of just points out how an individual might find themselves in HCBS in terms of the Medicaid managed care system in New York State. So again, we have, starting on the far left, the top part of this, the Medicaid managed care system in general for New York State. Then we move to the right, and we get more specified into the behavioral health Medicaid managed care system, which an individual, if they are in, would either be enrolled in a mainstream Medicaid managed care plan or the health and recovery, the HARP plan. And really that health and recovery, the HARP box, is who we're referring to when we refer to individuals who are assessed for HCBS services. Not to forget adults who are 21 and older or who might be in an HIV SNP. So from that, we move to, if an individual is in a HARP, they can be assessed for HCBS eligibility. If they are deemed not eligible for HCBS, then that's kind of where the flow would stop. If they are deemed eligible for HCBS, they're either deemed eligible, as we've stated before, for Tier 1 or Tier 2, and then we move on. Okay.
And just to underscore that even if somebody is deemed not eligible for HCBS or eligible for HCBS, it's very important to underscore this and make sure that we all remember that the individual is always eligible for all the other services we talked about. And again, in other presentations that are coming up, we're going to talk more in specifics about those services. But just because somebody is not eligible for HCBS, they are still eligible for clinic services, for opiate treatment services, for PROS and ACT, and so forth and so on. This workflow is only for HCBS and eligibility. All other programs and services outside of HCBS and HARP have their own requirements. They have their own medical necessity. They have their own processes, and this does not take it away from them whatsoever. It's important to underscore that the individual can continue with other services as needed and as appropriate. Okay, so our next slide, which is probably very hard to see because actually I can't see, but I think it's very important to kind of underscore, and also just to mention that this presentation was actually, done in more detail on this particular workflow, in the plan of care workflow that, a number of us participated in. And not only did we talk about this workflow with our state partners, but also it was about the plan of care and how to complete a plan of care. So I would also invite you to do this. But we just wanted to cover quickly on this workflow as well, to set the stage and kind of put down the foundation here.
All I was also going to offer is that not only is the training available, but a PDF of the workflow itself is actually available online if individuals who are following this webinar wanted to see that a little bit closer than we have on the slide at the moment.
And actually the next slide before we'll get there has the words that people can read, but I think what's important to underscore here, what this provides is kind of the swim lanes that some individual would refer to, or, breaking this down on who's responsible for what and when. And as you can see in the center of it, right, you have the center point is the care coordinator, who, is part of the part of that starts this process, especially as it relates to HCBS and HARP. It's very important, again, to just quickly go through this. The health home care manager is the one who would conduct the assessment. The assessment currently is really in two parts. There's the brief eligibility assessment that's conducted. It really is brief and could be conducted on the phone, and that really right away can determine if somebody's eligible for HCBS services or not. And the goal here is to really get the individual to those programs and services that they need. So that kicks off that process, working together with the managed care company, working together with the individual. The beginning of the plan of care, starts getting put together, the identification of the goals and needs of the individual, what would be the best, provider and settings for this individual to get their services. But the referral and the process can start right after the eligibility assessment. It is still expected that the full assessment gets completed, of course, and there's up to 90 days to complete. I know the state, would hope and I think the best practice would be to complete it in 30 days, but it is allowed up to 90 days to complete that. But the individual should not wait for the full assessment to be completed before the referral process starts. So if, so that's kind of just gives you the visual here a little bit, and the next slide kind of quickly goes through it in words, again, about the brief eligibility assessment, submits, the requirements to the managed care company, the health home care manager. The managed care company issues the level of service determination. What they're doing is kind of saying, yes, this makes sense, this meets the requirements. Then the referral starts to the HCBS provider, and so forth. We're not going to go through all of these bullets here because we have one of the presentations in this series is actually going to dive much deeper into it. But again, it's important to underscore the crucial and center piece and the role that the health home care manager plays in here in working with the individual managed care companies and the adult HCBS providers in making sure that individuals get the services they need to get. Okay, so part of it is when, of course, the individual is referred and is assessed, to the HCBS provider. The HCBS provider, then kind of starts their own process. They meet with the individual. They conduct their intake process, the kind of intake assessment process themselves, and then they have to determine together, again, working with the individual, what would be the scope and duration and frequency that this person would come to them. So that would mean, so they would have to, when we talk about scope, duration, and frequency, sometimes people say, well, what does that really mean? Well, think about if you ever had to go to a physical therapist, or if you knew anybody who had to go to a physical therapy, or any, rehab services for that matter. The discussion is about how often do you come? So it's how many days a week do I have to come? For how many hours do I have to come? And for how long? Is it a 3-month course of treatment, 6 months, and so forth? So when we talk about that, that's what we refer to. So the HCBS provider's role in the beginning is to kind of identify that and to determine what that scope frequency and duration would be. And when they make that determination, they then work directly with the managed care company or the BHO to obtain the authorization to continue providing those services. So they would provide that. And the state have developed a form. They work together with the managed care company and developed a pre-authorization or prior authorization form that HCBS providers would use. They would complete that form. They would submit it to the managed care company, and then they would be getting authorization. At the same time, they would work together and notify the health home care manager on that scope, duration, and frequency, so that information can also get back into the plan of care that the health home care manager is putting together. The concurrent authorizations, and when we mean concurrent, so after the initial course, let's say it's been 3 months or 6 months, if the HCBS provider working together with the individual feels like there's, it needs to get extended, the authorization, or more services, maybe there's more intensity, less intensity, and so forth, but they need another 3 months, that would be a concurrent review or concurrent authorization. When it comes to concurrent authorization, the HCBS providers would work with a managed care company or a BHO to make the determination. At that point, the form is not required. The HCBS provider can complete the same form they completed before with new information, of course, or they can do a telephonic review for the concurrent authorizations. It's only during the prior authorization the form is required to be completed and submitted. And again, all the HCBS providers should work directly with the managed care companies and BHOs to really to determine the fine points of their processes on authorization. These are just generic statewide rules. Okay, now I'll turn it over to Meg.
Yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about person-centered planning and recovery, which, as we all know, that was a major core value and component in HCBS services. So bringing it all together, the comprehensive integrated plan of care. As Boris mentioned, we have done a lot of trainings and put together a lot of resources related to HCBS and the plan of care. We actually have a presentation specifically done with our state partners on how to put together a recovery-oriented, person-centered plan of care for HCBS. So I would invite you to visit, again, MCTAC's website for those slides and information, but we're going to talk about some of the major components of that presentation right now. So as we noted earlier, recovery-oriented is a big part and value of the home and community-based services. And here's an interesting definition for recovery that we really focus on for the services. So recovery is a journey of healing and transformation, enabling a person with a mental health or substance use problem to live a meaningful life in a community of his or her choice while striving to reach his or her full potential. And I'd just like to start off this section with that quote. And also it sets the stage for understanding person-centered planning through SAMHSA's definition of what that is, which is seen as a collaborative process where service recipients participate in the development of goals and services provided. So when working with an individual who's been deemed HCBS eligible, it's really important to talk to them about what their goals are in the development of their plan of care and the services that they'll be receiving to the greatest extent possible. Effective person-centered planning really strengthens the voice of individuals, builds resiliency, and fosters recovery. The process of developing a person-centered plan of care is supported by the development of a partnership and process for collaboration, both between health home care managers and the individual receiving services. And I would also go as far as to say also the home and community-based service provider as well as the MCO. So really collaboration and communication between all those parties is critically important. Okay, behavioral health, home and community-based services, and the plan of care. So there are federal requirements consistent with person-centered planning that are included in what is to be required in the actual plan of care document itself. Again, the full plan of care training is available through mictac.org. New York State has issued behavioral health HCBS template and checklist, which is available on New York State's Department of Health website. So I would encourage everyone, if you haven't already visited there, to go there. But again, we just wanted to highlight the federal requirements that are also included in the New York State plan of care that is used for recipients of home and community-based services. Another really big component of New York State's behavioral health home and community-based services is conflict-free home and community-based referrals. So this is really about individual choice again. And so HARP enrollees shall be provided with a choice of home and community-based services designated providers from the MCO's network of a particular service. With respect to conflict-free care management requirements for health homes, to promote and ensure integrated care for the best interest of the client, it's possible that an individual may receive care management and direct care services from the same entity. However, in these instances, the care management and direct service components will be under different administrative or supervisory structures. Okay, so really this is just talking about how the HARP-enrolled individual shall be provided with choice for their HCBS designated providers and how to deal with the fact that an individual may receive care management and direct care services from the same entity. Okay. All right, care planning and practice. So these are just some components, again, that were reviewed during the full plan of care training, which is available on mictac.org, and are really just the components that we'd like to highlight in terms of what the care manager needs to provide in terms of important information regarding the services, supports, and resources in order for this to truly be considered person-centered and to enable the person to participate fully and effectively in this process. These are just some tips on how to provide this information. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just highlight some and would invite everyone to kind of read through this a little bit more in depth, either on MCTAC with the full training or reviewing these slides later on. So really kind of assessing a person's knowledge and awareness of their chronic health conditions and treatment options, using appropriate and understandable language, avoiding acronyms and abbreviations when possible, providing visuals, including charts or diagrams when necessary, understanding that we all have different learning styles, so trying to work with the best system of understanding that that individual can truly understand and participate in this care planning process. Having copies or brochures for service providers and community resources available for these individuals. Maybe providing a fact sheet on diagnoses and or services. If possible, sharing outcome data from provider agencies so that if an individual is going to be receiving care for a certain diagnoses and service from a certain provider, they might be able to see what the outcomes that provider has for the services they're providing themselves. And offer to share copies of this information with natural supports, such as the parent, spouse, or friends, if and only if an appropriate release has been signed. So just some tips on care planning and practice. Okay, Boris is going to take us through some HCBS business rules.
Yep. All right, thank you, Megan. Again, just to underscore, so those best practices on care planning, person-centered, even though we emphasize it for HCBS and HARP, I think those are good practices for all individuals and for everybody that you serve. So in regards to the HCBS, some of the business rules, so I think it's important to note that HCBS does have utilization thresholds. They're outlined here by Tier 1 and Tier 2. The thresholds do not include the crisis respite ones, and at this time, they're in calendar year. These dollar amounts are managed by the managed care organizations and kept track by the managed care organizations, and of course, if the individual is receiving HCBS services from multiple providers, this becomes even more important, or if the individual is moving from one provider to another, to make sure that the individual does not go above these thresholds. There are some opportunities to go beyond the thresholds that are outlined here, and it's just important to note that as well. And again, each kind of the managed care company has their own process in going through that at this time. The other business rule to kind of underscore is kind of the allowable billing combinations. And what this provides is a list of all the kind of the HCBS services and the services and programs that are currently and been available. And again, to underscore here is, some HCBS services are part of or similar to, I should say, some of the services that are already been in existence for a while. So again, if you look at PROS, you'll see, if you go to PROS and PSR, it's blank. And that indicates that that's not allowable. And the reason is because psychosocial rehab is a component of PROS, as well as IPRT and CDT. If you go down the list of ACT, you would see that all of them is no, because if anybody who's enrolled in ACT, all of the HCBS services are really the components of ACT, again, outside of the respite, the crisis respites. This next slide just shows you that all HCBS services could be provided with other HCBS services, so I think this is kind of a given, but this just highlights that there are no restrictions in that sense for these particular services that's on this grid. Okay, there's, in addition to those business rules, there is a CMS setting rule, and what that really talks about is where the HCBS services could be provided and to whom based on their place of residence. And so there's a lot of information out there. We wanted to touch base and make sure that individuals knew that even if the individual is HARP eligible and is deemed to be eligible for HCBS services, based on their residential setting, because of CMS ruling, they might not be able to receive HCBS services at that time until, they change their setting of residence. And the goal here is, from the CMS perspective, is the individual, should really be integrated, into the community and really have be in a residential setting in that capacity, and then they'll be able to receive HCBS services. This continues with some of the rules here on that setting, just to give folks some understanding on it. What OMH has done, and I believe OASIS as well, is actually they're coming up with a grid that lines up all of the residential settings that the individuals might be living in to provide that, who might be eligible and who's not. So as that information becomes available, we definitely will be sharing that with everybody. There's some information that has been available that was shared, and additional is coming on these residential rules. But again, the important part is here to remember is that some individuals, based on their residential setting, might not be eligible for HCBS services. And so I think in summary here, it's a variety of treatment and rehab services that are available through New York State. The health home care manager's role is to provide the individual with enough information so they can make an informed and meaningful choice. The health home workflow and expedited work are tools, and resources and trainings are available through OMH, OASIS, DOH, and MCTAC, and other partners as well, like NIAPRAS and CPI and CASA as well. And again, this is just the beginning, and part of what we're focusing to underscore here is that we want the individuals to really have enough information to make that meaningful choice. So that's why we put together this series and have 3 more parts to it. So this way, you as individuals who work with clients and members can give them that information and provide that information for them.
Absolutely. So I'm going to just quickly go through some of our frequently asked questions. As Boris said, there's a multitude of resources out there, and some of us had actually come across the same questions multiple times that we've gotten from providers, from care managers. So we put them together just to kind of walk through and hope to provide some resources on a fast turnaround. So our home and community-based services only made available for HARP-eligible clients. Hopefully we've answered that with these slides, but yes, HCBS are only available to eligible individuals enrolled in a HARP or HIV SNP plan after they've gone through the brief and full assessments. Again, we kind of walked through that earlier in the slides, but if you want information about the workflow, you can click on this hyperlink in the slides, which will hopefully be available shortly on the TAC website and other partner resource websites. Will managed care organizations know who the designated HCBS providers are? And how will care managers know who the HCBS providers are and which ones are in each plan's network? This is a frequently asked question, and rightly so. Plans are provided with the information and the list of designated providers, and it is also publicly available on the OMH website and can be accessed through this link. Care managers should have a list of designated providers and should also have a list of HCBS providers within each plan's network. I think that's something important to emphasize, that HCBS providers must contract with the MCOs, so it is important for care managers to understand by different managed care plan who the HCBS providers are in contract with them. Because for an individual in their HARP, whatever HARP plan they're enrolled in will determine which providers they can work with in terms of which HCBS provider is contracted with the same plan. Okay. Can homeless clients use a crisis respite HCBS service? If an individual is HARP eligible, yes, but note that crisis respite has usage caps as outlined in the HCBS manual and the various MCTAC trainings, which are also hyperlinked on this slide. How do agencies identify if a client is HARP HCBS eligible? We talked through that with EPACES and the H codes. So visit the earlier slides, and you can also click on the hyperlink for more information. Are HARPs required to have case managers, and how are clients assigned to health home care managers? Yes, HARPs are required to have case managers, and the expectation is that most face-to-face care management will be done through health homes. Each health home has its own assignment process. Okay. And finally, as we know there are still some outstanding questions, we would encourage you to follow up with an email to the appropriate state office, depending on what your question is about. We have OASIS and OMH's managed care related email inbox listed here. Please email them with any additional questions you might have around HCBS and the process. So with that, I think Boris and I are going to close this first webinar in our 4-part webinar series. We would encourage you to stay tuned for the next 3 webinars that will be dropping shortly. And we want to thank you for joining us today. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.